Alright, we're doing more firmware hacking. Today we're going to do it on some PDAs. In this case, it is an HTC created Dell Axim X51V. Now, if you have been following the show, in early episodes I have done some segments on the Windows Mobile 5 version of this device, and it sucks. Dell does not know what the fuck they're doing when it comes to making a Windows Mobile device. In fact, I know a lot of people that are going to bitch and complain how much Windows Mobile sucks. Now, the cool thing about HTC devices is they usually disclose enough information for talented hackers and technophiles to create their own what's called cooked ROMs using something called a ROM kitchen. Now, in essence, a ROM kitchen is a set of tools and utilities that are used somewhat like Nlight or a Linux build distribution to build a custom Windows Mobile environment for your platform, for your device, suited to your needs. Now, this is normally running a really crappy copy of Windows Mobile 5. Now, Zero is a really big fan of HTC devices. He's actually the one who introduced me to this type of stuff. And whenever you're doing any kind of firmware flashing, you always have to outweigh the pros and the cons. What are you going to gain? What are you going to lose? Is this going to be risky to do? Is there a fail-safe? Is there a recovery method? You do not want to just jump face first into a 10-foot pool and then realize when it's too late that there's no water. Now, fortunately, a lot of this can be relatively easy and there's no chances of brick. Now, before you even actually flash the device, we have to understand how the device works. So the device was built. We have a flash ROM or some kind of storage chip on the actual PDA or phone or smartphone, whatever it may be, that will hold our operating system. How does that get programmed? You can't exactly pull the chip out. Well, you can't pull the chip out and put it in a programmer. It's built into the board. There's no optical drive. There's no USB drive. But there is an SD card and a compact flash card. Now, a lot of HTC devices can, in fact, be reflashed, firmware upgraded, through the actual USB port using ActiveSync. That might fail, so there needs to be a redundancy. What happens if something goes wrong? Power failure, rabbit chews through a cable, God really, really hates you and decides to strike your computer with a bolt of lightning. Usually they put in some kind of recovery mode or a backup modes or an SD card recovery utility. And this is another instance of using an OEM's devices against them to upgrade your device to make it do whatever you want. No more, fuck you, Dell, your Windows Mobile, anything sucks. And the one cool thing about these Dell Axims, the X5 and 50 series are QVGA, 320x240, and they're very good devices. I love them. The X51V and the X50V are full VGA, 640x480 with graphics acceleration. Now, unfortunately, with the cooked ROMs that I'll be putting on here, the graphics acceleration isn't completely worked out yet, but that's here nor there. There's a lot more benefits than there are drawbacks. So let's go to the computer side. We'll gather some information real quick about exactly what we need to do to get things going. What we're looking at right now is the equivalent of a VNC copy of my Pocket PC. This is my mobile, or we use this for screen captures on the Pocket PC. Now, of course, I've done a few little software tweaks to it that really do not increase its performance whatsoever. Now, we're going to go into the settings real quick and just verify what kind of ROM and what kind of hardware specifications that we're using, because this is all information we're going to need to know later so we can do our research. Alright, so we're currently running Microsoft Windows Mobile version 5.0, OS 5.1.70, build blah blah blah. So we verified the CPU, blah, yay. I've got to tell you, the Windows Mobile 5 sucks so horrible on the Dell Axims. Okay, so here's our device system information. We're running a Dell Axim X51V on an Intel PXA270 CPU. We have 624 megahertz X-scale CPU, so we can downclock to about 215, 64 megabytes of RAM, 256 megabytes of ROM. The ROM is the actual flash chip that will be holding our operating system as well as our installed applications. And we're currently running ROM version 806. Now this is actually a stock Dell ROM, and it sucks balls. Alright, so we're going to minimize out of this. HTCgeeks.com. If you have an HTC device, whether it be a smartphone or a PDA, I'd highly recommend hopping your browser over to HTCgeeks.com and taking a look at what kind of work that they've done on your device. Chances being that they will have something to improve your piece of crap. So I've already gone ahead to the Dell Axim X51 series, and they are currently up to Lenny SH Windows Mobile 6 L11 20273, blah, 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 blah. Of course, other people were involved in making this, and I'd like to extend my utmost gratitude to them. They have truly made this device not suck. They've got some screen captures of some of the capabilities, and it even does a side-by-side comparison of what the stock Dell edition does, the bare bones edition, and the Lenny edition does. Notice how the stock edition does nothing. The Lenny edition does a whole lot more. Games, Microsoft Office, SQL Mobile, SD Auto Run, which is a very fun application, .NET, should be CE, I don't know why they have it as CF. Got Bluetooth, FTP, remote desktop, menu sounds, whole bunch of stuff. Now, you got to become a member if you want to use their direct downloads. Otherwise, use RapidShare. I've become a member. Good idea. Now, the risks. Can you brick it? Theoretically, no. I've never actually encountered a brick. So, I've already gone ahead and I've downloaded a copy of the actual RAR file, and I extracted it. And these two files, one will be an NB0 file, which is the actual operating system that will be installed to the flash ROM, and a CRC file to make sure that there are no physical transfer errors. A CRC file is pretty much just a numerical check to make sure that the file is intact and whole, because if this image fails when it writes to your actual device, you're going to have a brick. So the CRC is there in place to make sure that that file is whole, complete, and there are no errors in it. Now, these need to be transferred over to an SD card, which I've already done. I'm using a really old 128 megabyte SD card. It's formatted as FAT32. So, now all of this is done, I'm actually going to go and readjust the camera angle so we can go and get an idea of the bootloader. Okay, so I've got my SD card in hand, I've got my Pocket PC, and we need to figure out how to put this into bootloader mode. Now, there are certain HTC products that you can update through USB and ActiveSync, which is a kind of a problem if you're running OS X or if you're running Linux. Luckily, most devices have some kind of button combination press that'll actually put it into an SD card or some kind of backup utility or install utility just in case. Now, whenever you're doing this, ever, period, whatsoever, I don't want to hear any shit from anyone, make sure you have the power pack plugged in. Don't do this from battery. If your battery dies, you might wind up with a brick. Now, luckily, I really don't give a crap too much, but I still have it plugged into the power. I'm going to re-angle the camera. Now, to get into the bootloader mode, it's kind of complicated. I got to hold the wireless button, the power button, and then hold the hard reset button on the back. Release hard reset, but still hold the power and wireless with the SD card inserted. So I'm going to go ahead, insert the SD card, and we're going to go ahead, we're going to re-angle the camera because I have a no bullshit policy on this show. So I'm going to do all of this real time, straight to tape. If this doesn't work, I'm going to have a brick or waste of time. So let's get to it. Alright, here we are booting to the default desktop, and we need to hit the power button, the wireless button, and the reset button pretty much at the same time. So I'm going to go and try to get hands around this without blocking the shot too much. So we're going to hold the wireless button, and then we're going to hit reset on the back with the stylus, release that, and that's the hardest part. having to hit the to release the reset while still holding the wireless and power button. And there's the file that we want to update to. We're going to hit the little center action button over here, and it's going to say press action key again to update within 3 seconds, or wait 3 seconds to abort. And it's going to read the SD card, it's going to verify the CRC, and it's going to go ahead and install the operating system. Keeping in mind that doing this will wipe everything you have installed on the actual device whatsoever. You're going to have to reconfigure your active sync, make sure you back up your contacts, make sure you back up your SIM card if it's a smartphone, make sure you have pretty much all of your applications backed up. It's going to completely format and reinstall this new ROM Kitchen cooked version of Windows Mobile 6 for the Dell Axum. Now, this could take a little while. Be patient. I'm just going to cut frame. Once it starts ending the process and it gets to the finalized installer, we'll get back to this. Alrighty, took about 10-15 minutes. It says update completed. Image update finished. Please press power and reset to do a full hard reset manually. So that means we got to take the stylus, give the little bastard a reach around, and hit the power button. Give it a hard reset. And there we go. Reflashed with an operating system that doesn't suck. Alright, so here we have it. I had to reconfigure it. I haven't set the clock yet, but just for the sake of getting on with the segment, you can notice that the start menu is a little bit different. At the top we actually have a battery gauge. I don't know if you can notice this light green bar. It's also in addition to this ROM. We have a whole lot more programs. We've got built-in games. We've got a Bluetooth Explorer. Bluetooth wasn't working all too well before. Pocket RAR, quick menu, remote desktop, that wasn't included before, a YouTube player, and an audio mixer. They call it X51 mix. It allows you to have sound profiles for the specific device, extra bass, extra treble. Wireless power, enabling and disabling Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Windows Media Player with more codec support. A screen capture utility. In the settings alone, they actually have, we'll go to the system information real quick. And here we go. We're running a Dell Axum X51V, ROM version L11 Lenny SH, which means we're up, we're running, and we're reconfigured. In the past, you've heard me bitch and complain about how Windows Mobile 5 on a Dell Axum X51V really sucks. Now, it doesn't. One cool thing about this is if you actually have a phone, a smartphone or an HTC-based phone, you can actually use the USB to PC, as well as the modem initialization, and you can actually go online through your cell phone. I actually have used this with my Windows Mobile-based phones in the past using a similar ROM. So, with all of that in mind, the question is, are you brave enough to do something like this? Are you dumb enough to do something like this? Are you smart enough to do something like this? And is it worth it? In my opinion, yes. Now, perhaps in later segments we'll cover ROM kitchens. I'm not too sure, because that's a pretty dicey area. I do know that we do have an HTC Touch Pro segment lined up in the near future, so you can always be looking forward to that. So, this was just an eye-opener. There's a lot more information on the internet. I'll put a lot more in the show notes. I really didn't go into an in-detail how-to, because it's all on the HTC Geeks and XDA developer websites, on the forums, on their wikis about your specific device. So if you're running an HTC device, chances being is you can customize it, optimize it, and make it your device, and take away that OEM branding that makes it suck oh so much. For any more information, go and hit the show notes. I'll have some links and information in there. If you need any help on any of these topics, you can always peg me on the forums or on IRC as always. Alright everyone, if you break your device, don't blame me.
Okay, for this project we are making what pretty well is a universal dipole base for amateur radio. If you want to have an easy to do amateur radio antenna, or at least the base of one, in this case I'm actually going to make a 10-meter dipole, but this frame can be used for any size and can be changed at any time at a later date. You will need some coax. I have coax here that already has one end that is crimped on with a PL259 connector that is going to work attached to my 10-meter capable high-frequency base station radio for amateur radio. The other end doesn't have an end on it, so we're actually going to strip this down and use in just a bit. You'll also need a piece of PVC. This is about 8 inches long. Really, the length of this is not material at all. This part does not matter. You'll also want a hole through it so that you can pass the cable cleanly through. So you want a hole that's big enough to actually get this cable worked through. And there we go. So now I have my cable actually poking through. And that's going to be the base. The other things that you will need are some cable to use for the actual elements. In this case, this is 18 gauge, a 60-foot roll of 18 gauge cable. That's going to make my dipole elements. And then also hose clamps to secure everything together. We're not going to be soldering on this particular base. You can solder if you'd like. There's not really any reason to solder it if you don't want to. This base will work just fine without it. So I'm going to go ahead and start the construction here. I've got a thing of hose clamps, and I haven't even taken them out of the package yet, so that's what we're going to do. So here we have the hose clamps. I don't think those are going to be, nope, those are not quite big enough for our purposes, so we're going to use the big ones. The big ones should work okay. Yeah. Okay, we'll be using the 2 large hose clamps out of this pack. Set that over there. And then I'm going to go ahead and take the tape here off of this cable so it's no longer bundled. We don't need the bundle any longer. Set all this stuff aside. And here we go with the cable. So now what I've got here is I've already taken and scored just a little bit there. I probably am going to want to score that some more than what I have. So I'll get out my blade here. And I'm going to score this side just a little bit more, just to make it a little more rounded here. I just want to, cut back on the possibility of the PVC pipe messing with the coax. So that's basically what I'm doing there. Oh, drop my coax in the floor. That's not good of me. Okay, what you're going to want to do is run the coax through the PVC pipe. Okay. Unfortunately, that blade is nowhere near sharp enough to cut this. So, I have these. Just a Radio Shack generic hobby knife type thing. And all I'm going to do here is strip away some of this coax. I lack proper cable strippers, so that's why I'm doing it this way. I'm hoping that I don't damage anything in the process. Okay, we're back. I have unwoven this. I have removed the dielectric from the center conductor, and here I have, as you can see, let me see if I can get a good shot on the camera there. So I have the shield here, and then I have the center conductor here. And what I'm going to do is bring these back down, and I'm going to step over here out of frame a little bit and get myself a zip tie. Now, unfortunately, the only zip ties I happen to have on me at the moment are a whole lot bigger than what I need. But that's okay. They're zip ties, and we can cut the ends of them off. So it's all good. Okay, I'm going to need 3 zip ties for this. Okay. Now the first zip tie we'll use to basically make a kind of strain relief on the cable. So here we have the cable shoved through the PVC. We have our ends split like this so that we have the shield here and the center conductor here. And basically what we want to do is attach this zip tie up pretty close to where these come through at. About here or so. Just pretty close. And then get that zip tie, just get it on there just good and tight. And then trim off your extra. Okay. That is going to make us a relief to help keep this from pulling back through. That'll make a nice relief for us. So as you can see, now I can't actually pull that through the PVC. So that part's good. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to take these, flatten them down a little bit, and I'm actually going to zip tie these together, and then I'm going to zip tie here so that this piece stays exactly how it is. So I actually got fewer zip ties than I need. I'm going to go ahead and zip tie the bottom just because it'll be easier to go ahead and do this first. But we've got our bit there. And I stretch that zip tie, get that in there good, and get it pulled decently tight. And I'm not going to worry about perfectly removing the excess. But as you can see now, we have, with the two zip ties, this coax is not coming out of that PVC. Okay, the next bit is going to be the hose clamps. Now these hose clamps are going to take a little while to crank down, so I'm going to do that part off camera. And the next bit, but I'll go ahead and do this part here on camera. All I'm doing with this is bending down, and I'm going to use these to help bend it. But I left a little bit of the dielectric just because I want to make sure and keep that dielectric there. I want to make sure and keep the shield from making any electrical contact with the center conductor here. Very important. Then I'm going to take another zip tie, and I'm going to need 2 total. So I'm going to get another one out of the bag here. Okay. First one I'm going to use to just tie this down. On second thought, on this design, I'm just going to leave it. It's okay. This is a bit tarnished. I don't know how well this is going to work. I probably should have actually cut the cable a little further down, but this is a trial run here of making this. I've never made this particular one before, but I have seen it many times. But what we're going to do here is we're going to take and put this clamp, this hose clamp, and take and twist this up first. Just twisting, just to kind of help hold it all together. Not overly important. I'm just doing it to make things a little more convenient. I'm going to do the same thing to this side. Okay, and then I'm going to actually cut this length off a little bit because it's longer than what I actually need. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, make them about equal or so. Okay, well, I cut this side shorter than I intended, but that's okay. Okay, the next step is the hose clamp. You take the hose clamp and you put it over here and you tighten it down. And you tighten it pretty well. Go ahead and put it on like that, and you tighten the thing down all the way, and then you do the same thing with the other hose clamp on the other side. These hose clamps are what is going to actually tie to our cable that we're going to use for the elements. I'm going to go ahead and go off camera again because these are going to take a little while to actually tighten down, so I'm going to go off camera, go ahead and assemble this, and then get ready for the next step, which the next step I'll show you what that looks like, and then I'll go ahead and talk about the actual dipole portion of it. So, okay, I've tightened the hose clamps down, as you can see. And let me get a good shot here. As you can see, the hose clamps are just holding the wire down. And we have the center conductor here being held down here. The shield of the coax held down with this one. We have our zip ties to hold the cable in place. And this is now the completed dipole base that we were making. And the reason for the PVC is the PVC gives you something nice and rigid to attach to. You can also pass a rope through here, or a string, or whatever you have available to you, and tie this up somewhere without actually getting anything anywhere close to the beginnings of your elements here. The next step is going to be to hit the internet and find a dipole calculator. I have one bookmarked. As I said, I'm going to be making a 10-meter dipole, but this can be used to make any size dipole that you want to make. I don't recommend using it for any frequency that is higher than, you wouldn't want to make anything higher than 440 megahertz with this, so you wouldn't want to use this for 900 megahertz, you wouldn't want to use this for 2.4 gigahertz, you really would not want to use this setup for Wi-Fi or anything even remotely close to it. But I'm an amateur radio operator, and I have my technician license, and the technician license with amateur radio in the United States gives the operator access to something that's called the 10-meter band, which the section of it that I'm interested in is from 28.3 megahertz to 28.5 megahertz. So I'm going to make this dipole for 28.4 megahertz, which is right in the middle, and this is going to then let me use the new HF radio that I bought or bartered for. Didn't buy it, I bartered. Amateur radio, we barter everything. But this will let you use that, and this will make a nice base, and in the event that I want to use a frequency higher than 2.4 gigahertz, it's very, very easy, or I'm sorry, if I want to use a frequency where the wavelength is longer than 10 meter or longer than 2 meter or something like that, whatever the wavelength is, if I want to use a new frequency, all I have to do is go out, buy some wire, or pull some wire out of the back, or wherever I need to get wire long enough to make the dipole, strip it, make sure it's heavy enough gauge for the dipole I'm making, and then attach it to this. All we're actually going to do is take the wire, slide it underneath the hose clamp, and just tie these two together by just squeezing them together. That's how the electrical connection is made for this. And this is actually an antenna I learned to make from my local amateur radio club. We actually made one. They had a base already made, but they added wire to it to make a dipole to use on field day this year. If you are into amateur radio and you don't know what field day is, I would suggest that you go find out. Field day is a great event. If you are not into amateur radio, I would suggest that you go find a local amateur radio club and look into field day. They'll be having one next year. Amateur radio is a great hobby to get into, and it lets you play with cool stuff like this legally. Well, you can play with cool stuff like this legally anyway, but I'm going to actually use it to transmit a powerful radio signal, and that's not always legal. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over to the internet, find out the length that I need for my dipole. I can tell you as a rule of thumb, this is 10 meter. Your dipole is going to be half of your wavelength. The wavelength in this case is approximately 10 meters. So you take that, cut it in half, that's approximately 5 meters. 5 meters converted to feet is approximately 15, 16 feet. So I'm looking at about 16 feet total for both cables, the cable going this way and the cable going this way. So I need to make two about 8-foot cables or so for the band that I'm interested in. But I'm going to go find out what the exact lengths are, so I'm going to hit an online calculator that I have bookmarked, and we'll check that out. Okay, here's an online calculator for the Kitchener-Waterloo Amateur Radio Club, and I have put in the frequency that I am interested in, which in this case is 28.4 megahertz. I've already hit the calculate button. It has already given me answers, and I need to make two about 8-foot 3-inch legs for each side of the dipole. So you can see here, this is for the 10-meter band. Remember, a dipole is about half of the wavelength. Well, a dipole is half of the wavelength. In this case, about 10 meters becomes about 5 meters. About 5 meters is right at about 16.5 feet. And then half of that for each leg of the dipole is 8 1/4 feet. So that's what I'm going to be shooting for. I will post a link to this on the show notes, but to be honest, I found it as the first hit whenever I used Google and searched for dipole calculator. Okay, I'm not actually going to finish the dipole tonight. This is the wire that I'm going to end up using for the dipole, but I'm not going to finish it tonight. But what I am going to do instead is show you with this piece of scrap wire that I've got just exactly how you would connect it into the system here. So all you have to do is get your scrap wire out of the way, take and back off the hose clamps, or one of the hose clamps. In this case I'm going to back off the one that's tying to the shield. Take one leg of your dipole that you have measured. Keep in mind that you have about 1 inch or however long from the hose clamp to the middle here. So cut it to length, keeping that in mind. Then take your hose clamp, loosen it up. Okay, I've got it loose. Slide these under together. Put them together like this. And then tighten your hose clamp back down. The antenna makes electrical connection through the hose clamp and the copper. And once you get your hose clamp tightened back down, like so, have a nice connection there. Then you just take this, run this out, and there is one leg of the dipole on your brand new homemade dipole base for amateur radio, or you can use it for CB or whatever you want to do. Again, I pretty well am of the opinion that this should not be used for any frequency higher than 440 megahertz, 440 megahertz. Actually, probably any frequency higher than about 150 megahertz is too much for this particular design. But where your frequency is less than that, this is a great base type to use to make your dipole. And the best part about those frequencies is they are somewhat forgiving on this. So I'm going to go ahead and end this segment for now, because you can see how to actually make your base. All you need are a piece of PVC, a couple of hose clamps, some coax cable, some zip ties, and your coax cable. It is nice if your coax cable has already been crimped with the end that you're going to use. In my case, it's PL259. That's your most common end that you use, anything amateur radio related. And that is the show. That is the antenna. And don't worry about these legs. They probably won't actually cause you enough interference for you to worry about removing them. If you really are worried about it, cut them back so they're not over the top of the antenna, but don't cut them all the way back, because remember, you have to loosen the hose clamp to put your dipole element on and then tighten it back down. So that is this segment, and I am the Ophidian. Thank you.
I've got a lot of crap in front of me, and I've got a lot of topic to cover, not a lot of time to do it. Today, in this segment, we're going to do serial ports, serial communication. Now, what is serial communication? Serial communication usually employs one transmit and one receive line, as well as a common ground, to transmit data between a piece of equipment to a computer. Now, I've got a bunch of devices here that all use some form of serial communication to communicate to the outside world. Now, let's do some examples. I've got my Pro 95 radio scanner. A lot of scanners nowadays actually have a serial port interface to allow you to program the memory, the banks, and features. And in fact, using third-party software, I can soft mod it to pick up frequencies that it normally can't. I've actually got a Zip-It Z1 handheld instant messenger. This is actually a toy, instant messenger for kids, so they would stop tying up the computer. On the motherboard, they actually have two serial ports, and these serial ports can actually be tied into, and you can tie other devices into it. Devices such as GPS. Just goes to tell you that most GPS units, by IEEE standards, have to spit out a serial compliant output, meaning it has to have a serial port. So all of these USB serial, USB GPSs typically come with a cable that's nothing more than a serial adapter. USB to serial adapter. I'll get to that in a moment. Now, if you've actually got a car, has the on. In America, it's called OnStar. Basically, what it is it's GPS with a CDMA phone or a GSM phone that, if you ever need help or assistance, you can push a button on your console and it'll call out to a service center. If you're ever in an accident, the accelerometer or the airbags or something goes wrong, it actually calls out and says, "Hey, this person's in danger," and they get on the line and say, "Where are you?" The GPS on board will tell them your position. Now, it could also be a bad thing, because can someone else track it? I don't know. But point being is, perhaps you might actually have this hardware installed in your car, but you don't want to pay for that monthly service. You still have a GPS unit that spits out a serial signal that you can interface into your own hardware. Get into that in a little bit. We've also got routers, like the Linksys WRT line of routers. We'll actually go down to the hardware level in a minute and we'll take a look at this. This actually has dual onboard serial ports. People have been able to take, and we'll get into this in the future, DD or OpenWRT, allowing us a firmware hack, and one of those serial ports can be used as a control head. That control head could be, in fact, a RS-232, a serial port COM device, PDA, Zip It, Z1. I'm really scatterbrained here, got a lot to cover. Other people have also put in GPS units, because the GPS has serial, and the Wi-Fi router has serial. With some modifications, you can pretty much have an all-in-one embedded war driving kit right inside the router. Other routers also include the Faunera routers. These have Atheros-based chipsets, which, if you're familiar with Linux, the Atheros-based chipsets allows you to do things like packet injection and web cracking and all that other fun, naughty stuff that we won't be covering on the show. But point being is that this board actually has a TTL-level serial port, which will allow us, again, serial communication to a shell to control these little devices. I've also got a Linksys Slug. It's a network-attached storage running off of an Intel Xscale 266 MHz CPU. Again, has a serial port that allows you to add more devices. Also allows you serial communication to the actual shell. I've also got a really old-school external modem. We're going to be playing with this in a little bit. Radio BBS, another thing that we're going to be getting into. This is an actual vintage radio bulletin board system. This is a modem as well as a BBS where messages can be stored, so like email, over ham radio. This will be featured on the show at some point. Satellite box. Satellite box. On the back end of this satellite box, there's something called a low-speed data port. The low-speed data port is pretty much a serial control cable that allows you to control this box via a wired connection. This is what home DVRs use to actually change the channel on your satellite or cable TV boxes. There's actually a really fun, cool application that I used to use back in the day. I actually used to share the video from my bedroom and my lab to the same box. Now, to control my satellite box, I just ran a serial control cable from my PC and controlled the box via a serial line. Top-end AV equipment will actually have onboard serial communications between the receivers, the DVD players, the audio amplifiers, the splitters, the disc changers, what have you, and they're all interlinked with serial communication. Now, serial communication is extremely important because it's a very, very basic form of communication between devices, and it can actually be essential on adding on new features to a device. So, I've got some of these devices. Let me re-angle the camera real quick and I'll show you some of the hardware level, and then we're going to get to the PC side and I'll explain a little bit more about serial, because with serial you've actually got three different voltage formats. We've got TTL, or transistor-transistor logic, which is 3.3 volts. We've got CMOS, or complementary metal oxide semiconductors, CMOS, which is a 5-volt logic level, and RS-232, RS-232 being a 12-volt logic level. Now, one major problem between all of this is some devices may be running at TTL, some devices may be running at CMOS, some devices may be actually running at RS-232. Now, the standard is actually RS-232. You know, before we go to the hardware side, let's go to the computer side, and I'll do a little bit of explaining about that. So here we have the Wikipedia article on RS-232. Now it says, in telecommunications, RS-232, or recommended standard 232, is a standard for serial binary data signals connecting between DTE, or data terminal equipment, and DCE, data circuit terminating equipment. It is commonly used in computer serial ports. Now, I'll put a link to this on the show notes. I can't read the whole thing to you, but basically it explains the scope of the standard, the history, the limitations of what it's capable of, its role in computers, the standard details, voltage levels as I've just described, and the different types of connectors. Typically it's a DB9 or a DB25 connector. Now, the most important part is the pinouts. The pinouts themselves actually have a common ground, protective ground, transmit data, TX, receive data, RX, data terminal ready, DTR, which basically states that the terminal is actually ready to receive and or transmit data. Data set ready, meaning the terminal is ready to, or device is ready to transmit data. Request to send, meaning I want to send you data, are you ready? In this case, DSR, data set ready, would be in a proper state. Clear to send, which basically means I'm in a listening state, it's okay for you to send data. And DCD, or just CD, or carrier detect. Carrier detect basically means that two computers have initialized, or two pieces of equipment have initialized a session, and they have both agreed that they want to communicate with each other. When dealing with modems, or multiple devices on one standard RS-232 line, you can also have the ring indicator. This is typically used for modems. Now, if we go on down, it actually goes into pretty much everything I've said, but overly complicated terms. Now, if you look at an actual a DB9 serial port, it has 9 pins. Like I said, pin 1, DCD, pin 2, receive, pin 3, transmit, pin 4, data terminal ready, pin 5 is ground, pin 6 is data set ready, pin 7 is request to send, pin 8 clear to send, pin 9 ring indicator. More information about the DB9 and DB25 pinouts on the show notes. Okay, so what else do we have? Now that we know that we've got the RS-232 standard, now the RS-232 standard also protocol. There's ASCII, ANSI, VT100. There's different types of protocols and a way of actually communicating. Now, whenever you're doing any kind of communication, you're going to have the appropriate cable. And I'll put this in the show notes as well as more information about this. These are called null modems. What null modems do are they're just ways of hooking up different pieces of equipment. For a perfect example is that the Linksys WRT router, the firmware router, a lot of the devices that I'll be showcasing in later firmware hacking segments will actually have a TTL level 3-wire serial port. How are you going to hook up a 9-pin connector to something that only has 3 pins? You actually have to create something called a null modem. What a null modem will do is, now if we're going to an actual DB9 to a DB25, you'll notice that all of the pins are actually physically connected. So it actually knows each one of those devices under both hardware and software level know when they can communicate with each other. If you use these connectors, or what's called loopbacks, if you notice that the transmit and the receive lines, pin 2 and pin 3, are actually tied together. Data carrier detect, ring indicate, and all the other necessary pins to actually initialize an actual session are all looped together. This basically means whatever you're actually sending just gets looped right back to the equipment itself. Really good for testing out whether or not your equipment's actually transmitting or receiving or has an error between the two. This is a simple 3-wire null modem without handshaking. Handshaking is a type of communication layer where it actually uses data carrier, DCD, data carrier detect, ring indicate, carrier detect, data set ready, terminal ready. Now, some equipment and software require that you actually have the DCD and the data set ready, request to send, clear to send in the proper states before it will actually work. In this case, this type of null modem will be completely useless and fail utterly. In this case, we'll use a null modem with a loopback handshaking. If you notice that certain pins like pin 1, 6, and 4, and if we go to our pinouts, pin 1, data carrier detect, whoops, back in there a bit. Alright, pin 1, 6, and 4, so 6 is data set ready, and pin 4, data terminal ready. Basically, that fools the equipment into thinking that transmission is ready to engage and commence. And you'll also notice that pin 5 has a common ground between both ports, and the transmit and receive are actually 69ing. Transmit is hooked up to receive, and receive is hooked up to transmit. That way, it's literally 69ing. And down here would be the DB25 equivalent. Further down the page, we actually have null modems with partial handshaking, where it doesn't actually ground data carrier detect, ring indicate, data set ready. It actually requires that the software side initiate the actual handshaking, meaning are you ready to receive data, are you ready to transmit data, and other communications. A lot of devices actually, in fact, use simple serial communications. And this would be a full null modem with full handshaking. Notice that there's no loopback. There's no way of fooling the hardware or software into thinking that the attached equipment is in fact either ready to transmit or will transmit. Later on, we will actually be playing with null modems quite a bit. And this website, which I'll put in the show notes, has a lot of really good information about gender benders and adapters, and one other piece of software, which we'll get into a little bit later, on how to actually sniff and snoop serial information, serial data on serial, not just RS-232, but actual serial communications. Alright, let's get into some hardware, because software is boring. Here in front of me we have just some of the few things that will be covered in future segments. Now, not everything here shown here right now today will be covered on the show, either because it's just a bitch to mod or hard to get your hands on. So, here we have a Linksys Slug. It's a network attached storage. It actually has a 3-wire serial port. It's actually TTL level, meaning it's 3.3 volt. Now, over here we actually have the inside of a Faunera 2200. Here's the original. The inside of a Faunera 2200. This pin header over here has a serial port on it. Again, TTL level. That's great. This is a Zip-It Z1 Instant Messenger. I doubt I'll actually show any how-to tutorials on the show just because the soldering in this thing's a bastard. But again, it's a 3.3 volt TTL serial port. This thing actually runs Linux. So with some software, or if you have a PDA for that matter, a Palm or a Windows mobile device, you can actually hook a TTL serial port, so I can run a little serial terminal on here, and because these two little bastards down here are running Linux, I can actually have a portable or embedded or even a handheld or a mini backpack, whatever the hell you want to do with it, machine. So that's just some of the stuff. Now, of course, I have the internals of a Linksys WRT router. And where are you? Serial port off frame. Serial port, got a dual serial port right here, which means you got 2 serial ports to do whatever the hell you want with. Microsoft Pharos 360 GPS receiver. Again, TTL. All of these devices are TTL voltage levels. That's great. What happens when you have a device that's not TTL? And this is where level converters come in. Before we even get into level converters, we actually need to talk about serial ports. I don't know about you, but my laptop doesn't have a serial port. Just so happens that these USB to serial adapters exist. Now, what's cool about these is if you actually get one based off of a Prolific chipset, more about the Prolific chipset in the show notes, or an FTDI. Now, I don't have my FTDI to showcase, but I do have two Prolific ones I'd like to show you. Prolific and FTDI do not really give too much of a rat's ass about whether or not CMOS, TTL, or RS-232. The internal chipset does all of the complicated level converting for you. Now, this is actually the GPS cable for my, well, GPS. It's a USB GPS, and inside of it is the exact same chipset that's in here. So it just so happens that maybe you have laying around your house some kind of cell phone data cable, or some kind of data cable that has USB on one end and maybe a funky connector on the other. Maybe it has a headphone jack. Headphone jacks are actually really good to use as serial port connectors, primarily because in simple serial communication, you only need 3 wires: transmit, receive, and ground. Now, this is a circuit that I created based off of the Max 232 chipset. 5-volt regulator, a couple of coupling capacitors, headphone jack for the actual interface, and I have ground, black wire for ground, red for receive, and green for transmit, just with the old phone freaking protocol days. You know, let's go to the computer side real quick, and I'll show you a little bit more about these Max 232 chips. Alright, well, here's the data sheet for the Max 232 driver, or what they call a line driver. It uses a 5-volt power source. You can go through it. They actually do have a 3.3 volt one, which is really good if you're running in a Faunera, a WRT, a Slug, or something that actually has a 3.3 volt power source internally. That will allow you to power the chip itself. So whether you have a device that runs off a 5 volt or 3.3, there's a lot of technical data about in here, a lot of mumbo jumbo about power curves and voltage levels and pinouts and all that jazz. But you know, once you go through the data sheet, once we get to the right freaking page, where the hell are you? Here we go. This is a generic line driver. Now, if you take a quick look over to my circuit, which I have over here, I'll put more in the show notes about it. This is a very common circuit. And then you go back over to the data sheet real quick, you'll notice that this pretty much built exactly what the data sheet told me to do. I've got 5 capacitors just to have for a voltage doubler as well as coupling. I've got TTL or CMOS inputs and RS-232 outputs tied to the proper pins. Using this chip or a few others, if you're too lazy, you can always go and buy one of these boards pre-built. You can pretty much interface any kind of serial device. Now, of course, this isn't going to, this is only simple serial 3-wire. It's not going to handle anything that also requires data, DCD, data terminal ready, carrier detect, ring indicate, and such. This is for simple serial devices only. And that's pretty much what we're mostly going to be dealing with. Just to make it a little less confusing, here is just a very simple sample schematic that you can find on the internet of how to hook up the Max 232. Like I said, if you need a 3-volt solution and you need to power the chip off of 3 volts, use the max 3232 and not the 232. More in the show notes about actual part numbers. Always, show notes, great resource.
You knew I was going to do that.
Yeah, I always knew. Alright, I've got Uber Archangel here, and he's a bit of an overclocker. So we're going to get into overclocking today. Now, explain overclocking.
Overclocking is essentially where you run your parts faster than they were manufacturally made to run. It's just like taking an engine and putting a blower on it to increase the speed on your engine for your car. Same idea, a little bit different for electronics, but same idea.
Alright. Well, you know, there's also underclocking.
Yeah, underclocking is meant mainly for laptops. What it'll actually do is it'll increase your battery power, therefore you don't have to use your batteries often like you have.
That's one thing, especially Mustang has shown in previous segments, that you know, the reason that computers are getting hotter, which is something we're going to have to cover with this, is cooling. What happens is we're getting parts so small that when you're putting electrons through it, it generates more heat. It's kind of like when you have a very small, thin tube and you're putting way too much pressure through it, in this case electrons, it generates more heat. So the #1 enemy to any computer is heat.
Yeah, there's multiple ways of cooling for overclocking. You can go anything from air to water to liquid nitrogen to dry ice. There's a plethora of ways to cool your computer. I prefer air cooling. When done right, you can get relatively close temperatures to water cooling without the cost.
All right, well, what are generally, like, alright, you got a computer. You can go to like mom and pop computer shop, or you can go to your local electronic retailer and pick up a computer these days. Are those okay for overclocking, or is it something that you should just go... I mean, me personally, I don't do a lot of overclocking. I used to back in the day, maybe a couple of megahertz on the old Celerons and whatnot, but you wouldn't exactly go to Gateway or Dell or Toshiba or IBM to get your parts. You'd sit there, you'd go to a computer shop, you do all your research about the clock speed and the bus. Go into a little bit of that.
If you buy a Dell computer, Gateway computer, you might be able to marginally overclock it, and by that I mean maybe 200 megahertz top end if you're lucky, with putting extra cooling and everything on top of it. If you buy the parts that are specifically made to run faster, you can normally overclock a lot higher. Like the computer I'm going to be showing in the later segment, I will probably be able to hit 4 to 4.2 gigahertz off of a 3.2 gigahertz base.
Now, would you go with Intel or AMD, or is it really just do your homework?
A lot of it's do your homework, and if you don't have a lot of money, AMD, you can normally get a Black Edition for a lot cheaper than you can get a Intel Black Edition. So what the Black Edition is, it's an unlock multiplier that allows you to increase the speed very easily.
Alright, multiplier. You know what, I'm just going to let you do this. Multiplier and clock bus, go into that, explain it a bit.
Everything starts out at 100 megahertz front side bus. Believe it or not, that's actually what everything is. What it'll have is you have double data rate, and then you have DDR2, and it ends up multiplying it up to where you get 800 and 1200 megahertz out of your RAM. The average computer, it just starts at 200 when you're looking in the BIOS, because it already takes into effect some of the multipliers from it. When you increase your front side bus, you're going to increase the speed of your RAM and your processor, and depending on whether you have AMD or Intel, it can actually increase the Northbridge communication speed. Now, there are dividers that will separate it up between Intel and AMD. Depending on what you have will depend on whether you actually have a way to separate those, so that you'll be able to control the front side bus strictly for the processor, and strictly for the RAM, and strictly for the VGA. With the more modern motherboards, VGA is almost always able to be controlled independently of the rest, but in prior boards it was not.
Yeah. And as always, the faster that you're going to clock your CPU, your graphics, and your RAM, the more heat it's going to generate. And heat is a #1 enemy of overclocking. Now, I did overclocking a very long time ago. You remember earlier we were talking about overclocking Macs. Now, back in the day, I think it was the Motorola 68K CPUs, which are also used in the Sega Genesis, which you can easily overclock. Now, you can even overclock an NES. Back in the old days, you just take out the frequency oscillator, which was the actual clock for the front side bus, but nowadays it's all software controlled under the BIOS. Now the one bad thing about buying from an actual OEM provider, especially Dell, is all of the BIOS features are locked out. So certain motherboard manufacturers, this is where BIOS hacking comes in, and it also falls into some of the firmware hacks that we're probably going to be covering on the show, and some of those techniques as well. Is there like specific manufacturers that you as an overclocker would look for?
For motherboards, yes. For if you're looking for general brands, there's also preferences there. If I were to look for a computer that I want to be able to overclock right off the bat, I'm going to be looking at Voodoo. I'm going to be looking at Falcon Northwest. The reason why is they use all stock parts. They also use parts that are meant to last a really long time, which is what you're looking for when you go to overclock. Because as you overclock, as Fox said, you will increase the heat. And as you increase heat, it's going to increase wear and tear on your parts. And as wear and tear increases, life of parts decreases. So if you buy good parts to begin with that are going to last you probably 2 years after the warranty runs out, so you're looking at 5 years, when you overclock it, you're going to knock it back to 3 years. But the thing is, it's going to pan out because by 3 years, you're probably going to need to buy new parts anyway.
Yeah, computers usually have an average lifespan these days between 1.5 and 3 years. So, I find a lot of computers in the garbage. Whether they're overclockable or not is completely moot. Now, why would you overclock? Now I know you do a lot of gaming. I'm the anti-gamer. I fucking hate gamers. I hate you. Alright, I hate you.
I know you do. I know you do.
Okay. Because you can't handle my kind of love. You can't. So, besides gaming, because gaming does require a lot of extra power and performance, what other reasons would you want?
Well, I get this question a whole lot, and the way I justify it is you buy the parts and you don't overclock in the beginning. And people look at me like I'm nuts. Well, why am I spending this extra money? You might spend an extra $50 getting the parts that you actually need to overclock over what you would normally be buying. That $50 will translate into normally 6 to 7 months that you'll be able to extend your hardware by overclocking it to match the needs of the software that's coming out. Therefore expanding the lifetime of your computer and saving more money to be able to buy your next computer.
You know, I actually do know quite a few people that will actually overclock multi-core CPU systems so they can compile code faster, because they do some pretty hardcore stuff. So it's not just for gaming. But with overclocking, you will shorten the overall life expectancy of your hardware. But then again, that's also for underclocking. I mean, back in the early days, we're talking 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, the Intel Celeron processor and the Pentium 2 processors, like Archangel said, that normally it starts out with a 100 megahertz front side bus, and it was the BIOS that determined the actual clock multiplier of the CPU frequency. So when you first turn the computer on and you go in, although you have a 450 megahertz CPU, it wants to run at 233 because it's at a default clock multiplier. If you actually take that, I actually have 450 megahertz CPUs that I have downclocked to about 300 megahertz that still work today, and they are at least 10 years old. I've actually got MMX CPUs still in use today, and you're probably saying, Fox, what the fuck am I going to do with a 150 megahertz CPU? You'd be surprised how useful something that low power could be used. As we've been trying to explain through BSoD, it's not how hard it doesn't matter how big your hardware is, it doesn't matter how fast it is, it doesn't matter how strong it is. The right tool for the right job. So let's go into some more of the other stuff. Like, what operating systems would you recommend overclocking for, or does it matter?
It does matter slightly, depending on which way you're going to overclock. If you are going to be able to get at the BIOS, so you actually built your computer so that you can get to the BIOS and be able to change the BIOS, it's not going to matter what platform you use at all in the slightest. One thing I do want to touch on before we get into OSs is warranties. When you overclock, 99% of the time you have voided your warranty. This is also why I said you overclock towards the end of the expected life of your parts to just get that extension of 6 or 7 months, because your warranty is already up.
You know, and I think we've showcased on previous episodes, warranties, accidental insurance, absolute must-have when you have that hacker mindset of, I'm going to take this apart, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm most likely going to break it, and I'm going to get my ass kicked if I out a couple of hundred, even if $1,000 on a piece of hardware because you didn't know what the hell you were doing.
Yeah, there's actually certain brands that will allow you to overclock. Like OCZ is set up for overclockers. They have an added voltage protection called EVP or EPV. and it'll give you an extension on the amount of voltage you can send to your RAM, allowing you to run your RAM at higher frequency. So, depending on what the brand is, you can actually get warranties that will cover mild overclocking.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah,
I didn't know they did that.
yeah, they just started it about a year ago. That they have warranties now where you can actually overclock. Now, it depends on the brand. You got to read up on your warranties. But OCZ is one of them where it has a 2.1 volt normal extended voltage for certain RAMs. Not all RAMs are covered. Platinum Edition is normally covered completely for the...
Well, you know, something I want to touch into. I'm an electronics guy. Everyone should know that by now. And everyone wonders why lower voltage is better. Most people say higher voltage is better, but let me put it to you like this. Back in the early days when RAM ran from 0 to 5 volts, meaning 0 is logic 0 and 5 volts is logic 1, the amount of time it takes to go from 0 to 5 volts is more if you had to go from 0 to 3 or 0 to 1.5. So the less voltage that you need, that spike and increase of voltage, is less time because, you know, it's distance. It's a physical distance. You have to get less distance. So there are actual mods, like especially back in the day, we actually had to do motherboard mods and change out capacitors and inductors and whatnot to actually shorten the actual response time. Also, power supplies are very important. You got to make sure you get a decent power supply, because if your power supply has a lot of noise and it's a shitty power supply, I know people that have spent over $3,000 on a really hardcore computer and $15 on a power supply.
Yeah. You got to, when you're buying a computer and you're building overclocking, you have to make sure your amperage is going to be able to handle what you're going to be overclocking.
You can never have too much. You can never have too much. Unless it's drawing too much.
Yeah.
If you have a 400 watt power supply and your computer is only estimated to pull 200 watts, that means you have 200 extra watts that, unless something goes horribly wrong, you should be safe.
Yeah. And most of my computers I overshoot by 2 to 250 because I estimate that I'm going to put in newer hardware, because I'm a gamer, to be able to overclock later, which is going to draw more power, so that gives you replaceability.
I'm a digital historian, so I'm going to be putting in a lot more hard drives, and those take up power as well.
I'll actually have a link for a power supply connector that I'll put up, or power supply calculator.
You know, we got show notes. Put a bunch of stuff in the show notes. Uber's already got stuff on the forums all about this topic, so if you have any questions or comments as this series goes by, you can contact Uber on the forums or via IRC, as always. Alright, so what's the first thing we need to showcase? What's the first thing you wanted to show for overclocking in this intro? Do you want to do the BIOS? Do you want to do hardware? You want to go through a hardware overview?
I want to go through OS preference, like we were starting to.
Alright.
OS preference, I prefer Windows. It's going to allow you to have access to more tools that will allow you to benchmark your computer. And that's important because if you have the benchmarks, you can see if your components in the first place are actually broken. You can actually get CPUs that are brand new that will run perfectly fine at your normal settings, but as soon as you go and you stress test it, so you run it as fast as it can, it shits the bed. You want to find that out as soon as possible. And you want to know that before you try to overclock it, because you're running up the voltage and you could possibly blow the CPU through the motherboard. We don't want to do that.
You also have to be careful because certain vendors, as soon as you open up the CPU packaging, they will not accept a refund or even an exchange. So before you even buy your CPU and your motherboard combo, make sure that where you're getting it from, the actual vendor, will allow you to say, okay, well, my CPU is not operating under my functional characteristics. It might work out of the box, but it's not working the way I want it to, and they will allow you to exchange it. Some places will actually charge you up to a 15% restocking fee, so if you have to keep, asking for a new CPU every 3 weeks and you still have to pay 15%, so if you spend $100 on that and you got to spend money to send it back, plus money to get a new one, watch out for that.
Yeah, and it's always good to benchmark your components when you get them, because then you know if it's going to be bad in a couple months when the warranty's already run out and you're screwed.
I've had that happen. I've made the mistake of not benchmarking my hardware and had a limited warranty on it. It crapped out. I pretty much had to bend over and enjoy it in the ass. That's about it.
Yeah, and for Windows you have the most number of benchmarking programs out there. A lot of them are free, some of them do cost money, but for the most part they're free. And the ones that do cost money normally have trials that you can actually use. You won't get all of the options, but it'll still give you a good enough benchmark to be able to tell whether your components are going to be able to do something. So I prefer Windows, but as for if you're accessing the BIOS, it doesn't matter what OS you use.
Well, the BIOS isn't OS dependent either way, so.
Yeah.
Alright, so what else do you want to run through in this one? Want to do some BIOS settings?
Yeah, we'll do some BIOS settings.
Alright, we'll cut frame, we'll set up, and we'll go and show you some of the features you need to look for in a BIOS.
Hello, this is Super Archangel. What I'm going to do right now is going into the BIOS. You hit delete on most computers, sometimes it's F3 or F1. It'll bring you into a screen like this. What we're going to do is we're going to go over where the information is, what you're looking for when you're trying to overclock in the BIOS, what are the actual features, and things you need to look out for. First, we're going to go through system information, because this will tell you what your CPU is currently running at, the number of CPUs, the system memory you have, and it also gives you your version for your BIOS and the build date for it. This is important because some newer CPUs aren't fully supported on older BIOSes, and also some newer BIOSes will allow you to overclock further. So writing down this information, always good to check on the net afterwards. Next, we're going to go into the advanced jumper-free settings. It'll either be considered jumper-free settings or it'll have OC configuration. This is normally where you go for your overclocking. Right now, as you can see, the AI overclock tuner is set to manual. That means I can adjust on this it happens to just be the front side bus, but I can adjust the front side bus to be able to overclock it. Some boards will have an automatic overclocking feature like this one does, and you'll be able to see how you have standard, which is just your normal, doesn't do anything, overclock 5%, 10%, 20%, and AI NOS. AI NOS is a Windows-based software utility to be able to control your CPU. Now, certain motherboards will actually cover an overclock that's done automatically by the motherboard. Asus does on some of their motherboards. Once again, you have to check your information per product to see whether that's an option. Right here we have the DRAM frequency. It's set to auto. The RAM that I have in there is currently 400 megahertz DDR. We're looking at an older computer right now because it has the basic features that a normal BIOS is going to have in an average computer. As you can see, you can set it manually to these megahertz. Some of them actually have it so you can adjust the megahertz like you can for the CPU frequency here, where you can go plus or minus and increase it in actual single intervals. I always try to go in intervals of 2 because computers like 2 better than just 1. It has to do with the coding base. You can also adjust the frequency that your PCI or your AGP is running at. This is, again, overclocking your North Bridge, which is your video controller. Right, we have here is the CPU core voltage. Now, as you can see, this goes up to 1.7 volts. I would never suggest running a CPU that high unless it's under the manufacturer's specs. There's actually white papers out for each individual processor that'll tell you what its max voltage is, what its max temperature is. They normally call them the thermal and voltage specifications. They can be found on the websites from the actual manufacturer. So you want to make sure that you can go up to that voltage, because going over that voltage is risking frying everything, and to me that's a risk I don't take. Right here we have the DDR reference voltage. This is for my RAM. I can up the voltage to 2.5, 2.65, and up to 2.85. Right here we have the voltage for my actual AGP slot, which will send the voltage through the actual GPU. So if you go to overclock your GPU and it's pulling too much power, you may need to increase this in the BIOS. But once again, increasing voltage beyond the specs of what it is actually able to be handled will fry it. And as I said before, there will be white papers and information on all of this from the actual manufacturers you'll be able to find on their websites. If you can't, I wouldn't buy from that manufacturer. Right here we have AI Booster support. This enables AI Booster. It's another thing like AI NOS, except it's not automatic. It allows you to change the values manually within Windows to be able to change your voltages and your frequencies. Next we're going to go into is CPU configuration. In here it'll have your caches, it'll have the actual front side bus speed that the CPU is running at. It'll normally list what the actual CPU is, like what the build number is. Sometimes it doesn't. That's why there's software programs to be able to look at that. It also has a CPU max limit where you can actually set the max, the actual limit for it so that you can boot older OSs that won't support as fast of a processor. And this is so old it even has hyper-threading control. This is CPU internal thermal control. Depending on the motherboard, depends on whether you have auto or disabled. What that is normally to shut it down so that it doesn't fry your CPU, so you almost always want it on auto. Some of them also have a CPU internal thermal control adjustment where if the temperature sensor is off by a few degrees, which I'm not sure how you would ascertain it's off by a few degrees, but if you for somehow know for a fact it's off by a few degrees, you can actually manually adjust it. Next we're going to go into the chipset settings. Chipset settings are normally your RAM settings and your graphics settings for your Northbridge. The configure DRAM by SPD. SPD is your normal default timings, which is the speed that it takes to go through each cycle of reading and writing to RAM. This is what's written on the actual RAM by the manufacturer that the motherboard picks up and reads and says, okay, let's use this at this speed. By disabling this, you're able to go in and change the timings. Memory acceleration mode, sometimes on certain motherboards they have it so that it'll automatically overclock or downclock the memory to match the CPU at a better frequency that'll work better. Because if you have mismatched CPU and memory speeds, it's not going to work as well as if they're synchronized. It's like having somebody that's saying +3 and you only have +2 to be able to put through for pipes. It doesn't work. It's like trying to send 3 gallons worth of water through a tube that's only able to handle 2 gallons. It's not going to work as well as if you're using 2 gallons for each tube and you have 2 tubes. Same idea. Then you have the APM configuration. This is for powering on, so you can power on your computer by USB, keyboard, etc. The reason why this is important is if you set it up so you can turn it on via your keyboard, you don't have to jump down and shut off the power button if something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to. Like if you're looking with the side of your case off and the CPU fan isn't started up and you're overclocking the CPU, it's not going to be good to have it running any longer than you need to. So if you're able to just hit a few keyboard buttons to shut it off or turn it on, it can save you a whole hell of a lot of money. And then you have your hardware monitor. Most people don't realize this is actually in the BIOS. It's a very important thing to look at. Most CPUs aren't supposed to run around the average temperature for an Intel. They don't want it to go above, I believe it's 42 Celsius right now. This is an older one. It runs at a higher temperature just because it's older. The other thing that's great about this is it'll give you your CPU fan, your chassis speed fan, and depending on the quality of the motherboard, you might actually get your RAM speed, all kinds of stuff, which is awesome. Now, it also gives you the voltage, and almost every motherboard that I've ever looked at will give you the voltage readout. This is important because if it's fluctuating more than 0.05 volts or 5/100ths of a volt, your power supply is not going to be stable enough for overclocking. As you can see, my 5-volt rail right now is bouncing all over the place, and if you look, it actually will bounce down to 4.96 volts, which means this won't necessarily handle a very good overclock, but that's only on the 5-volt rail. The voltage core voltage, which is your one for your CPU, if you actually look at that, that is only bouncing around maybe 1 to 2, so it's stable enough to do a mild overclock. You wouldn't be able to do a major overclock on it though. Alright, so in conclusion, those are the basics you want to look at for actually looking at your computer and actually looking into overclocking. As I would like to reiterate, it voids warranties. Check the warranties. And if you can, get accidental warranty on it because you didn't know you were overclocking anything.
Ignorance is bliss.